Hello, and welcome to the Sublime Podcast, the show that looks into everything about Gothic literature. It's the show that looks into the ins and outs of all things horror, scary, and supernatural. I'm your host, Ritha Hather, a student at the Ryerson School of Journalism. For this episode, we'll be talking about my favorite and probably the most fascinating theme of Gothic literature, which is doubles. Back in 2019, a new show called Living with Yourself popped up on Netflix. It lasted for a while and it only has one season, but it interested quite a few people. And by that I mean mainly me. The main character, Miles Elliott, is played by Paul Rudd, so what other reason do you need to watch it? How could you not be interested? From a young age, I've always been really curious and obsessed with the idea of having a double of yourself, or even like a clone. Just the idea of someone that's just like you, just roaming the world right alongside you. I've always loved the idea of it, and it's always fascinated me. I don't know, maybe it's just like a really narcissistic thing. But yeah, essentially a double is someone who is like you in almost every aspect, except they have a different mind. And so in the show, Living with Yourself, it follows the life of Miles Elliott, a man who's basically having a midlife crisis, and he's really unhappy in his life. In the first episode, called The Best You Can Be, Miles is desperate to change, and he wants his life to change, but he just doesn't know how, and he feels really stuck. His relationship with his wife is terrible, and he just needs a break from work, and he's overall really depressed. So one night after work, when he's feeling really down, Miles's friend tells him about this spa that he went to and how it's completely changed his life, and he recommends Miles to go and check it out. So he leaves him a card and tells him to call and book an appointment.
Okay, hey, you really want to know my secret?
No.
I went to a spa.
Your secret is you paid for a hand job?
No, not that kind, okay? It was like this cleanse. Full mind, body, soul. You have to be recommended by a previous client. It is highly exclusive.
And Miles, being incredibly depressed and desperate for change, makes the very unfortunate decision to actually call the spa up and try and book an appointment.
Top Hat Tea?
Yeah, hi. I'd like to make an appointment, please.
$50,000. 1730 Highway 27. Across from a Curves.
So he goes to the spa, and that's the last thing he remembers. Next thing he knows, he's waking up, buried alive in this plastic wrap thing. And just listen to this clip. He literally just wakes up buried alive, and if this doesn't scream Gothic horror, I don't know what does. So in his essay called The Monster Theory Reader, Sigmund Freud describes the double as this original reassurance of immortality. It was a way and a method of seeking immortality, basically. And it really ties into this show, because what Miles is really looking for is this perfect, easy, fixed opportunity that will save his life and allow him to move on and be more happy. And ironically, it sort of ends up him being dead and buried alive. So in the second episode, which is called Made in a Strip Mall, he wakes up dead in the forest, and he's really confused, and it's hilarious because he's wearing a diaper and nothing else. Just imagine like Paul Rudd in a diaper, and he's just sort of running around really confused. So he runs home and he meets this man in his house who is his supposed clone, and he is replaced with this better version of himself, Miles number 2, who is essentially the better version of him, and he acts as if nothing is wrong and as if he's always been there.
What are you? I don't want any trouble. I don't know what's happening. I would just like you to leave my house, please. You leave this house. In fact, what are you even doing here? I live here. I live here. I live here! Take it easy. Take it easy. What's happening? What's happening?
So in the third episode, called Green Tea, the two go back to the spa and try and figure things out and what essentially happened. And there's only 2 workers at the spa, and they tell them what actually happened and exactly what they've done. So here's the explanation.
This is a new process. Very difficult. People are not ready for this. Reproductive cloning is still illegal in 187 countries.
Cloning?
Ultra-rapid cloning, plus microsynaptic memory transfer.
Wait, you cloned me?
There you go. You hit the nail right on the head.
Well, what were you planning on doing with the original me? The me?
So eventually accepting what's happened, Miles and Miles number 2, his clone, they eventually come to this agreement that what's done is done, and they're just going to have to figure out a way to live together in a world where Miles essentially hides the fact that there is a clone version of himself. And he gets his clone to do all his dirty work, which is exactly what I would do. I mean, it's exactly what anyone would do with their clone. So his clone has to go to work, and he has to do everything for him and all his chores and errands. And, well, Miles stays home and he gets to work on his play, and he spends more time with his wife. But the thing that really starts chipping away at Miles is that he starts realizing that in a lot of ways the clone is doing a way better job than Miles would have at all the things that are Miles's jobs.
Think about it. You're the better me. My God. I'd give anything to be you. In fact, I just did. $50,000 to 2 guys in a massage parlor.
And it's really hard for Miles to admit that the clone is doing a much better job than Miles. And so similarly, in his essay, Freud describes this second stage of the double of basically allowing one to have this objective criticism of themselves. You're basically standing outside of your own body and you're watching yourself, and you're able to see yourself in a much more clearer light, and you can criticize your ego and who you are as a person much more thoroughly and much more clearly. And you can really see this in episode 2, where there's this sort of back and forth between Miles, and Miles it's really hard for him to admit that he can see that this clone is the perfect version of him, and he is a much better Miles. A Gothic novel that ties perfectly into this would be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, in which Dr. Jekyll creates this person, Mr. Hyde, through a potion, and Mr. Hyde is like his dual eviler self. He's like the evil version of his own self. And it's very similar to the show because Mr. Hyde and Dr. Jekyll are these 2 parts of one person who are fighting for control of one body. And in which case, it's a lot like Miles and Miles number 2, who are fighting for one life. And they're also trying to figure out, well, who deserves it and who doesn't, who goes and who stays. So Freud's theory of the uncanny and the double appears many times throughout both the show, Living with Yourself, and within Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And we see this idea of the double played out very elaborately, if not almost similarly, but also very differently in the stories. both Dr. Jekyll and Miles meet a double of themselves that they both initiate and they also play a hand in creating. So that's it for this episode. I hope you really enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.